So, back in early 2026, something pretty wild happened. A diplomatic crisis erupted that was, well, unlike anything we'd really seen before. It pushed two founding members of NATO right to the very edge of conflict. We're going to break down the story of how a fight over a huge Arctic territory threatened to completely shatter the world's most powerful military alliance.
I mean, it's a question that sounds like it's straight out of a political thriller, right? But this became terrifyingly real, and it forced everyone to ask a really fundamental question. What do you do when your most powerful protector starts acting like a predator?
Well, in January 2026, the world got its answer. We all found out just how fragile that whole system really was. A super high-stakes standoff with truly global implications was about to kick off. All right, let's get right into it. We're jumping in at the peak of the tension here. This is when a dispute that had been simmering for a while just completely spiraled out of control, turning into direct threats of not just economic but military force, all over the sovereign territory of Greenland. So this quote, wow, reportedly coming from the US president himself, it just sent absolute shockwaves around the world. I mean, this wasn't just talk, you know? It was a super blunt statement of a worldview where international law just doesn't matter as much as pure willpower. And that mindset, that was what was driving this entire crisis. I mean, the speed of this whole escalation is just staggering. Think about it. In less than 3 weeks, we went from some theoretical claims to direct threats against NATO itself, backed up by the threat of massive economic sanctions. And then, to top it all off, those AI images threatening annexation, that was just the final totally surreal cherry on top of a month of pure political brinkmanship. But, a crisis like this, it doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. To really get what happened, to understand how we got to the absolute brink in January 2026, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the groundwork, the months of pressure and provocation that were laid throughout the entire year before. So according to Danish media and their intelligence services, there was this really clear escalating pattern long before things totally blew up. It started with just rhetoric, right? But then it moved to a pretty provocative, uninvited visit by the vice president. After that, reports of covert influence operations started surfacing. And the final piece? Appointing a special envoy whose whole stated mission was basically annexation. Every single one of these steps was like a deliberate turn of the screw. A lot of analysts had a specific name for this kind of strategy. They called it hybrid warfare. And it makes sense because this wasn't your typical military campaign. Nope. This was a multi-pronged attack using political pressure, economic threats, and information or disinformation to hit a strategic goal. And the kicker? They did it all without firing a single shot. And this right here, it's a perfect illustration of the strategy, broken down by the Danish broadcaster DR. They saw it as happening in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1, the charm offensive. Try to win over the people of Greenland directly, kind of go around the Danish government. When that didn't work, pivot to Phase 2, the pressure campaign. Put the economic and diplomatic squeeze on Denmark. And all the while, Phase 3 was happening in the background, trying to infiltrate and destabilize the relationship between Greenland and Denmark from the inside out. Okay, but here's the thing. These threats, they weren't happening in a vacuum. The White House might have expected Denmark to just fold, but boy, did they miscalculate. The pushback from Denmark, from the rest of Europe, and even from inside the United States was swift, it was unified, and it was incredibly firm. Let's start at home, in the US. The administration just did not have the public on its side for this one, not even close. A YouGov poll laid out the reality in black and white. The American people were overwhelmingly against it. We're talking only 8% support for an invasion. That kind of weak public backing, that's a huge problem for any administration. And the opposition wasn't just at home, it was just as strong abroad and right in Washington. Denmark came out and said point blank, we will defend our territory and we're willing to invoke Article 5. That's NATO's all-for-one defense clause. The entire European Union promised full solidarity and even threatened to use its powerful anti-coercion instrument, basically a trade bazooka. And then, in a really rare show of unity, you had a bipartisan delegation from the US Congress literally fly to Copenhagen to show support for Denmark, calling the whole thing completely inappropriate. And then there was the military piece of this pushback. It was called Operation Arctic Endurance. And let me tell you, this was not just some routine training exercise. No, this was a massive political signal.
By sending a multinational force to Greenland, all these European allies created what's called a tripwire. It meant any aggressive move by the US wouldn't just be against Denmark, it'd be against a whole coalition of major European powers. It was a very clear, very united line drawn in the snow. So all of this pressure from every single direction, it all led to the climax of the crisis. It all came to a head at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Faced with this completely unified front, the hardline US position didn't just bend, it completely and totally collapsed.
So, what about this big deal that was announced at Davos? Well, there was a huge difference between what was claimed and what actually happened. The White House was spinning it as a major breakthrough. But NATO and Danish officials, they immediately came out and clarified, whoa, hold on a second, nothing new was agreed upon here. All that happened was a recommitment to a really old security agreement from 1951. The issue of sovereignty, it was never, ever on the table.
And of course, the press just had a field day with this. A bunch of news outlets started calling it a taco moment. Now, that's a bit of political jargon, I know, but it perfectly describes what happened. A total reversal. An abrupt climb down that was just obvious to everyone watching. The reversal was honestly just as dramatic as the original escalation had been.
And this quote from Aja Chemnitz, who's a voice for Greenland in the Danish parliament, really just nails the reaction on the ground. She said the claim of a deal was not real and was just creating total confusion. For the people at the very heart of this thing, the claims coming out of Davos were just seen for what they were, an attempt to save face after a massive diplomatic blunder.
So the immediate threat was over. No invasion, no trade war. But just because the crisis was averted doesn't mean it was erased. Not by a long shot. This whole episode left deep, lasting scars on the transatlantic alliance. And really, on America's standing in the world. And the long-term consequences, they were huge. Trust, which is, the absolute bedrock of any alliance, was just shattered. For the very first time, Danish intelligence actually listed a core US ally as a potential national security threat. Think about that. The whole crisis also lit a fire under European leaders to speed up their push for what they call strategic autonomy, basically the ability to defend themselves without having to rely on Washington. At the end of the day, it was a pretty stark lesson in the limits of raw power when up against a united front. Like the foreign policy expert Corey Shakes said, the damage from this is going to take a generation to repair. This wasn't just some minor disagreement you can smooth over. No. The very foundation of the alliance, that mutual respect for each other's sovereignty, had been shaken right to its core. So, after everything, all the threats, the talk of tariffs, the moving of troops, all that brinkmanship, what was the outcome? Well, nothing. The fundamental situation that Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark stayed exactly the same as it was before this whole thing started. A massive amount of political capital was burned and a ton of damage was done, all just to end up right back at square one. And that really leaves us with a profound and, frankly, a pretty unsettling question. What happens when an alliance's protector becomes its biggest threat? It's a question that completely changes the strategic math for allies all over the world. It forces them to totally reconsider the very nature of their relationship with the United States. And you can bet it's a question that has no easy answers.